I'm joined now by Mike Jones, Executive Director of Migration Watch UK. Mike, thanks for joining us here. We learned today in the newspapers that there's some advice to the Prime Minister that's been leaked saying that the European Court may delay these flights taking off even if this bill passes until after the general election.
Well, that's very interesting. I think the key point really is clause 4 in the Rwanda Bill. The European Court of Human Rights is subservient to parliamentary sovereignty, so I'm rather skeptical that they can stop the plan. However, politicians may choose to delay the Rwanda plan if they believe that the authority of the ECHR is legitimate in this case. But as we've seen in the rest of Europe, France, for example, recently ignored a ruling by the ECHR. Any decision to go against the legislation would be a political one rather than a legal obligation.
So I think the leaked advice allegedly refers to that. They're called Rule 39 orders, what people call the pyjama judges, who are dragged out of bed to bring forward emergency injunctions against the UK government to get people pulled off planes. The advice the Prime Minister allegedly said, we haven't seen all of it in total, that those the ECHR courts, those European courts, could delay reviewing those Rule 39 orders, which is effectively an injunction against the UK government, till after the general election. Now, the Prime Minister's been clear. He has said he will not allow any foreign courts to thwart his plan. But he and the rest of the Cabinet have stopped a long way short of saying that they will ignore those Rule 39 orders. And of course, that's what the Rebel Alliance, the right wing of the Conservative Party, of which I'm a proud member, the Rebel Alliance is trying to do through the legislation is rule those out of order. You're correct. France has ignored them. Do you suspect that the British Civil Service will allow a Prime Minister or other minister to ignore injunctions from international courts?
Well, certainly there may be internal pressure or nudging within the Home Office to pay as much attention to the ECHR as possible. You know, that's part of the problem. But, you know, Professor Richard Eakins of Policy Exchange, you know, he looked at the last interim injunction when Priti Patel tried to get the flights off to Rwanda, and he claimed they weren't legally binding. So if ministers do pay attention to the ECHR, that's a political choice. They're not compelled to delay this.
Quite right. As you say, France has ignored it. And in fact, we learnt from papers that came out between Christmas and New Year under the release of previous information rules that Tony Blair and his government contemplated ignoring it previously. But so far, this government has not in this case. This will be the third piece of legislation that my government has brought forward to try and get flights off to Rwanda. It seems to me that some of the briefing certainly around this is that it may fail. Of course, the government and I will try and make sure that it doesn't. Rob Jenrick, former immigration minister, said it's 3 strikes and you're out. Do you think if the government gets this piece of legislation wrong and we don't see flights take off to Rwanda, that the British electorate will say 3 strikes and you're out, Prime Minister?
100%. Jenrick is completely right on this. I mean, even if the Rwanda plan does go through, that won't necessarily save the Conservative government at the next election. But if it fails, you know, you're looking potentially at an electoral disaster. You got to realise the government had other ways of deporting illegal immigrants. You know, looking at the Human Rights Act. Potentially amending it. They could have negotiated a returns policy during the Brexit negotiations, but they didn't go down this avenue. They chose to, if you like, circumnavigate the system by outsourcing it to Rwanda. Now, if this fails, then you're not going to deport any illegals before the next election, and the British public will respond in kind.
But what I don't understand is it sounds like, there are ways of doing this. Rwanda may be it, Rwanda may not be it. The government has said clearly that they want to do it. So why can't we? Why can't we? Do you think there's a sort of a Whitehall inertia against this, or even government inertia against this, or a sort of an industrial industry of people trying to block these sorts of policies if the government wants to do it, I think it's clear the British people want them to do it. If the government wants to do it, why can't they?
I think Whitehall inertia applies to all sorts of different policy areas, not just immigration. But let's get to the root cause of this. The Human Rights Act was introduced in '98 by the Labour government, and it embeds the European Convention of Human Rights into British law. The convention makes it very difficult to deport illegal entrants because of something they call the principle of non-refoulement. So if there's even the slightest chance, less than 1%, that an illegal immigrant may be, harassed or roughed up in some way when they return to their country of origin, then they can't be deported. Now, my view is the convention is out of date. The human rights legislation was aimed specifically at refugees fleeing the Soviet Union, but the only country that remotely resembles the Soviet Union today is North Korea. But North Korea isn't in Europe, and most North Korean refugees make their way through China to South Korea. So I believe these laws are very much out of date and incompatible with controlling your borders and maintaining the rule of law.
Mike, thank you so much for joining us here. We can end on a point of agreement because I, like you, agree that the ECHR is completely out of date.